to civil society, working with media, working with the courts, to try and minimize and reduce the chance that we can have a second round of state capture and that we're sitting here again in 10 or 20 years' time talking about the same stuff. There need to be fundamental structural reforms in the criminal justice system. First, the level of vision and in ethos. The criminal justice system should be not be there to punish people and harm people. It should be there to make sure that all people are treated equally before the law, and it should thrive, or its key objective should be to gain public trust and legitimacy. And then we'll start seeing real public safety taking place. So those are just some issues I thought I'd throw out there. There are many more. We could have a whole conference on what should happen to the criminal justice system. But I thought I'd just mention a couple of issues now to spark some debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Newham. Thank you. Mr. Naidoo, tell me, after getting this picture from the two speakers, is there a step forward on this issue, or am I just being too optimistic?
Well, I think we're all here because we believe that there are things that we can do to move forward. So I'm grateful to the two previous presenters because it means I don't have to repeat a lot of stuff. So I really want to focus on 2 or 3 issues and be quite brief. Firstly, I agree with David in terms of his definition of institutions within the criminal justice sector. But I think we need to look at it a little bit more broadly than that. So, organizations or institutions that investigate maladministration, corruption, etc., should be included in that. And in that list, I would include the Auditor General, the Public Protector. But I think we also need, when we look at the criminal justice sector, and we can't ignore the role of the intelligence services. That's a critical role, and when we look at the sector, we must look at them as well. And then finally, the institution I think we really have to look at is Parliament. I mean, Parliament was a key enabler of state capture. And, you know, with all of the litigation that civil society conducted in terms of challenging the appointments of the heads of the NPA, the Hawks, the police, etc., etc., all of that became necessary because the accountability mechanisms that we have in the Constitution failed. So we had to resort to the courts. And so we recognize the role that civil society played in doing that, and we recognize the role that the courts played in upholding the values of our Constitution. But it should never have gotten to that point. So I don't think we can have a discussion about the weaknesses of the criminal justice sector without locating it in the broader context of the lack of accountability within our political system as a whole. So I think, you know, that's really something we need to look at, and we need to look at the accountability of Parliament and how Parliament holds institutions to account. So all of the institutions we're referring to within this broad criminal justice sector, in one way or another, report to Parliament. And the question is, what does Parliament then do? And the answer of the last few years has been very little, except to protect members of the executive and to protect those that were involved in state capture. So I just want to, you know, having said that, I just want to say make a few other points, and perhaps just to start with where Gareth was left off in terms of the NDPP or NPA and the appointment process of the NDPP. So again, yes, we welcome the fact that there's a much more open, much more consultative process. We don't know yet whether it's actually going to be open and transparent. We would hope that it's going to be open and transparent. I see no reason why interviews for the NDPP should not be done in public in the way that interviews for the heads of Chapter 9s are done, in the way that interviews for members of the judiciary is done through the JSC. There's no reason that shouldn't happen, but we don't have that guarantee. Secondly, we don't know what criteria they're going to use. The legislation talks only about a fit and proper person with relevant legal qualifications. But, you know, when you set the bar that low, all sorts of people can get across the line, as we've seen in the past. So, you know, that bar has got to be set a lot higher. And so the creation of criteria for the NDPP is important, because we want that panel to be able to interrogate and examine all of the candidates that come forward on the basis of some objective criteria and not of some subjective political determination. You know, one is already also concerned about the timeframes that are left for this panel to conclude its work. And I know that earlier this week, They set out a time frame process to conclude their work, but it's very truncated because we're now sitting almost at the end of October, and they're going to make a recommendation to the President before the end of November, which is a very, very short period of time in which to conduct such an important piece of work. The last point about the NDBB process is, and I agree with Gareth again, is that this broadly consultative process needs to be entrenched in legislation, and we can't leave it to the whim of the President to be able to do that. And I think the fact that the NPA Act is going to be reviewed by Parliament next year, because one of the things that came out of the Concord judgment in August this year on the NPA and the Kasana and Abrams matter was that CASAC challenged two aspects of the NPA Act. The discretion of the President to be able to extend the tenure of the National Director of Public Prosecutions beyond their age of 65. And the second one that we challenged was the discretion of the President to suspend a National Director indefinitely pending an inquiry into their fitness to hold office. We feel that both of those sections compromise the independence of the NDPP or a deputy NDPP. But that opens the door to deal with other aspects in the NPA Act that you referred to, Gareth, which I think as civil society and certainly as CASAC, we're going to be making representations to Parliament in terms of saying, you're looking at these two sections, you also need to look at other mechanisms to enhance the effectiveness and the accountability of the NPA. Just a few other points to make that haven't really come up yet is in terms of the, what would be a fit and proper anti-corruption agency for South Africa. And we've heard about this, many agencies that exist, the SIU, the Hawks, etc., etc. But there is no dedicated agency whose sole focus is fight corruption. The Hawks, as their name suggests, is the Directorate for Priority Crimes, which includes corruption. But who determines the priority within that? So does it meet the requirement that Glenister set? I don't know that it does, because it's not focused solely as an anti-corruption agency. Its location within the police is a huge problem, I agree. So, this is a piece of research that CASAC did as one of the first things when we were established in 2010, was a piece of research which produced a paper called Fighting Corruption Towards a Comprehensive Societal Response, and basically arguing that all sectors of society have a role to play in combating corruption. And the recommendation that came out in the report was arguing for the establishment of a dedicated anti-corruption agency with a three-pronged approach to look at prevention, enforcement, which includes prosecution, investigation and prosecution, and the aspect that we all forget about is public education around corruption. So we would certainly argue that we need to continue the debate around the establishment of such an agency. As an interesting point, in the National Planning Commission process, we made a submission to the Commission at the time, motivating for this dedicated agency. In the draft report, the draft National Development Plan, that recommendation was present and included. And then the final report of the NDP omitted that and said that no, they now believe that the multi-agency approach is the preferable one, because it's much more difficult, as they argued, to capture several agencies than to capture one agency. But that really then comes to two further points I want to make before I finish. The one is, whether you have an agency like that or not, you need to have a national anti-corruption strategy. We can't speak about fighting corruption in a vacuum without knowing really what is it that we're going to do to fight corruption. So we talk, so that's why government gets away with this rhetoric of saying we're fighting corruption, we stand against corruption, but you can't, there's nothing you can measure them against. And nobody has the responsibility for putting that in place. Parry, I know, have been involved for the last 2 or 3 years in helping government to put together such a national anti-corruption strategy. Unfortunately, it's still in a draft stage, and we need to push for its finalization and implementation. And I would argue that responsibility for that ought to lie within a dedicated anti-corruption agency. The final point I want to make, and I was with my friend here, John Gitongo. We were in Uganda last week looking with the many other representatives from across the continent, looking at anti-corruption initiatives across the continent. And the one issue that came up time and time again in our discussions there was the issue of political will. And whatever mechanisms one puts in place across the continent, and we had numerous examples, is that if there is a lack of political will, whatever mechanism you put in place will not succeed. So, you know, we can talk till we're blue in the face about a single agency, a multi-agency, you know, it's not going to get us anywhere. And, you know, there was some discussion around, well, what do we mean when we say political will? Because again, it's an easy term to throw around, but unless you unpack it, you know, it's meaningless. So we came up with the 2 or 3 or 4 aspects of it. First, that there must be adequate budgetary provision for such an agency. You can't set up institutions and then hamper them by not giving them resources. That's a very simple thing to do. You need to ensure that they have skilled investigators and prosecutors so that they can effectively prosecute crimes. And I think we've seen with the anti-corruption task team in the recent years that the only prosecutions for corruption have come about as a result of plea bargains. You know, there's been no actual cases that have gone to court. And does this speak to a lack of capacity within the Hawks and the NPA? It probably does. So we need, you know, political will is about ensuring that we have skilled people there. We then need to also ensure that there are adequate safeguards against political interference within those institutions. Gareth has spoken about how that has failed in respect of the DPCI. And we need to ensure that stronger protections are put in place. And finally, in terms of that anti-corruption strategy that I spoke about, we need to have a firm commitment towards a zero-tolerance approach towards corruption. Because if you're going to say, well, this amount of corruption is acceptable, then where do you draw that line? And I think we need to have a firm commitment to that so we really empower society to be able to tackle those issues. So I think, you know, in the context of locating the discussion, we need to take into account some of these other factors. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Mantashe Bambo, as the African Union has declared 2018 as the African Year Against Corruption, can you just give us an overview of this African Union Convention, but also touch on, for South Africa as a country, what is our commitment to this treaty, but also the African Union itself? Is it another talk shop, or is it just another theme given by the African Union towards fighting corruption is going to become a rhetoric?
Okay, thanks, Lucky. And thanks to my colleagues for their presentations. So, as Lucky mentioned earlier, Corruption Watch is, as well as looking at the criminal justice system, we're also looking at a South African analysis in light of being a signatory to the African Union Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption, which I'll refer to as the AUCPCC or the convention because it's quite lengthy. So, the Nigerian President Buhari, Muhammadu Buhari, has been tasked with being the champion for implementing this year of anti-corruption. They've dedicated that 2018 as the year of anti-corruption. And he's made some statements to say that, you know, corruption is one of the greatest enemies of our time. It runs completely counter to our shared values as Africans of justice, sense of fairness, law and order, equity and equality. And I mean, I think these are all things that we're quite aware of the impact of corruption on Africa as a continent. And so what the AUCPCC, its main aim is its focus is to combat corruption, and of course there are other regional and international instruments that have also been implemented by African states. So I won't go into details with those because my job is to just give you a bit more information on the convention and also what steps have been taken by South Africa as a result of being a signatory to the convention. So we've got the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Convention. It's also known as the OECD. There's the very well-known United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And then there's the South African Development Community Protocol on Corruption. So those are some of the regional and international instruments that have been ratified by South Africa. And when we get into detail with the convention itself, the Convention Against Corruption, it's got 28 articles. It was adopted in 2003. South Africa ratified the convention in 2005. So we're looking at about now 13 years since our ratification of that convention. And what is supposed to happen is that once a state has ratified the convention, all state parties are expected to domesticate their national legislative and policy instruments in accordance with this international convention. And the convention, these 28 articles that I speak of, it covers a wide range of offenses. So some of them includes bribery, illicit enrichment, illegal funding of political parties, money laundering, and diversion of property by public officials. So some people have, some legal experts have said that this convention is actually not adequate for the state of corruption in Africa, whereas you find that with others, they've said that it's the most comprehensive amongst the other regional anti-corruption conventions. And it serves as a milestone since it adopted measures against corruption which are specific to Africa itself. So I mean, that can be questionable, and I think it's a matter of opinion. So although the convention contains strong provisions, which it does, unfortunately, its resolution is only feasible if individual countries adopt and implement these, implement the provisions itself. Otherwise, it just becomes another document. So some of the interesting facts of this convention, we've got 40 countries that have ratified it. There's some like Angola, Mauritania, Somalia, South Sudan that still have not ratified the convention. And one of the articles that differs from the United Nations Convention, interestingly enough, which comes up in the African Union Convention, is that around political party funding, which, I mean, as we know now in South Africa has had some strides. And so that's one of the positive, how it positively differs from the United Nations Convention. And recently, as you know, there was the political party funding bill, but South Africa also introduced PRECA. It came after this being a signatory and after ratifying the convention. There's a lot of other, I think my colleagues mentioned, like the Financial Intelligence Center Act and so forth. There are other, and there's also the prevention, the POCA. When I start now with abbreviations, it's gonna
Organized crime.
Yes, Prevention of Organized Crime Act. So they were already existing legislations that were prior to South Africa being a signatory, but PRECA did come as a result of, it was passed afterwards as well. And so when the drafters of PRECA put it together, they were taking into consideration the South Africa being a signatory to this particular convention. And so, unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, after all these years after signing the convention, there's still been minimal progress by African countries, including South Africa. And one of the articles, specifically Article 22, provides that countries need to submit their annual reports to the board. And this just doesn't happen at all. And South Africa has never, in all its years of existence, has never actually submitted reports. Only 12 of the 40 countries have submitted reports. So we see how there really is a lack of, I don't know if we can refer to it as political will in this instance, but there is a lack of interest in countries actually adhering to what they've agreed to. So, like I've said, while the AU should be commended for creating anti-corruption institutions and implementing measures and strategies to fight corruption throughout the region, the reality is that corruption persists despite all these efforts. And Corruption Watch is, and like you mentioned this earlier on, we are a chapter of Transparency International, and together with all the chapters, this being the dedicated year to fight corruption, we all the chapters put together, and we wrote an open letter to the African Union with regards to this particular convention. And I'm just going to pick up some of the highlights that were in this letter. And one of the issues, which one of my colleagues already mentioned, is with regards to financial support. And we stated that funding must match commitments to help strengthen existing anti-corruption systems, and as well as to support civil society in this fight against corruption in our respective countries. Another one was the obvious one of treaty ratification, the fact that there are still so many countries that have not ratified this treaty. It was one of the requests that we made, that because this convention has been put in place as a shared roadmap, we need to ensure that all African countries become signatories to this treaty. And not just signatories and ratifying, but also actually taking the initiative to adhere to its provisions. So, believe it or not, there's also been allegations of corruption within the AU Advisory Board itself, and so we also requested that there be internal investigations into the African Union Advisory Board itself on corruption, and that any wrongdoers should be punished. We requested issues around procurement, open contracting, stolen assets, as well as shell companies, which are all issues that are dealt with within the convention itself. And so, really, just to wrap it all up, I think, one of the questions is has the South Africa being a signatory since 2005 to the African Union Convention on Combating Corruption, has it been beneficial? Has it made any difference to the state of corruption in our country, except for maybe issues like development of pieces of legislation, which in itself, as my colleagues have already mentioned, with regards to the state of the criminal justice system, doesn't seem to have been extremely beneficial in any event. And I think another question to bring to the floor, which I think one of my colleagues also mentioned, is this issue around education and retraining. And we see that the manifestation of corruption in Africa is also a reflection of the need for stronger leadership and oversight institutions. So tackling corruption acts and greed requires a reorientation of our attitudes and perceptions to corrupt practices. And will changing the state of play through retraining and education, will this instill better and more transparent values? And is this something that needs to be included within the convention itself, which then might assist in this fight against corruption? So that's where I leave it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists. I think we're able to squeeze that in 40 minutes. Well done. I'm not going to abuse my power as a chair and ask questions. I'll just open for attendees to also ask questions. I saw there was a roving mic earlier on. I wonder if we have one now. I've got one hand. Can I take a couple of hands? I've noted you, Mr. Dale.
I don't know if I'm recording.
I think it's for live streaming, yeah.
Okay. Two questions and comments. At the heart of everything that all the panelists have talked about is this political appointments, these issues of putting people in different spaces that don't have the capacity, don't belong, that are there for particular purposes to undermine, to make sure that information doesn't flow. The question is, it's clear that our approach so far in terms of this has not worked as civil society and as everything. The question is, why hasn't it worked? Why have we not been able to stop this? And so in other words, are we adopting the wrong tactics in terms of trying to stop? And here I'm asking, for example, don't we need, one of the issues, and I know it's like, as soon as you mention this, it's like, oh no, the Constitution is sacred. What about constitutional amendments? For example, to me, the heart of the problem is the way in which the executive has power in our entire political setup. The executive branch it was barred from the apartheid state, which was an executive-heavy, top-down power approach, which gives the president and the cabinet power to do all sorts of things, to appoint, to decide, to fire, all these things. Is that acceptable in the context of, shouldn't we be talking about possibly amending the way in which they set up? Because we can have all of these other things, but they're just like Band-Aids, and they clearly aren't working. You find a way around them. So in other words, the law itself, is the law itself a problem? And do we need to relook at the law in terms of where powers are given and who gets those? For example, appointment, line managers, so forth, or amendments to existing legislation as a secondary tactic as well. The second, so that's the first thing. The second one is, and I'm sure it wasn't intentional, I think it was just the way in which this was framed, but it's instructive that in the last 45 minutes, the role of the private sector and corporations has not been mentioned. Hardly at all. as if this whole problem is a problem simply of the state and of placing the proper people in there and getting our systems correct and everything. But every corrupt relationship, started with individuals or corporations, right from the arms deal, right from the Guptas, whatever it was. It was either individuals or corporations that essentially, it takes two to have a corrupt relationship, if not more. So in this context, the role of the private sector, I mean, we've just begun doing research as the unpaid benefit into the massive fraud that is taking place within the financial services sector. It's huge, and it's totally hidden. The Financial Sector Authority is captured completely by Liberty, Old Mutual, Sanlam, Alexander Ford, the big five that control 12.7 trillion rand in assets, 4 times our GDP. So we're talking about huge, the stuff that's going on here is small fry with the Guptas and everything else. So surely we need to start paying serious attention to going and looking at the relationships that seem hidden and legalized. So they're not, corporate capital is smart about whether they don't come out and this sort of, you know, suitcase money and all sorts of other things. It's about, it's built into the system. So in that context, I would be very interested to hear what people have to say about this, because to me, this is the fundamental challenge. We can replace political appointment, we can do, yes, and I agree that that would help. But unless we begin to go after the real, and PricewaterhouseCoopers' latest report is we are #1, again, in the world for what? White-collar crime. So we're not just the most unequal society in the world, we're the most fraudulent society in the world when it comes to those that have the most money. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. McKenzie. Another hand. In one of the sessions I attended, there was a very interesting question which relates to your first question around what is the big binding issue for us as civil society? Because we normally get together around an issue, but as soon as Zuma has stepped down, we all relax. And we think that everything is going to be okay. And what are we doing now? Thank you, Dale.
I would like just to clarify regarding Angola not signing the Convention on Corruption. Yes. No, actually, there is a caveat. The National Assembly ratified it in 2006, but the president never signed it. So that's why it was waiting. The new president signed it in March, and the instruments have been deposited with the African Union, so Angola is now part of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to have a voice from Angola. Any other question before I give the panelists an opportunity to respond? Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off in relation to the 2 points that Dale made. Yeah, I think we agree that the process of these political appointments is problematic, hugely problematic. And I think the point you make about the power of the executive and needing to look at those appointment processes in terms of what the Constitution says and what the law says is absolutely correct. Certainly, using the example of the Police Commissioner and the National Director of Public Prosecutions, I think civil society organizations have said a lot about how those processes need to be changed. The National Development Plan, again, puts out a process for the appointment of the police commissioners, which has been ignored. You know, Cyril's own National Development Plan, and it's been ignored. You know, but I think the caveat to the issue about the power of the executive, because I think it comes back to the point I was making earlier about the issue of public accountability. But any exercise of public power has got to be held accountable. So whether it's exercised by the executive or by parliament or by whomsoever, there needs to be accountability mechanisms in place. And that's why I say when the executive uses its power, the problem is not so much the use of that power, but the failure to hold the power to account through parliament. And we've seen that even where power has been given to parliament in terms of legislation to make Chapter 9 appointments, they've been proven quite capable of messing those up as well. So the question is, you know, I agree, you know, the Constitution is not sacrosanct in any way, but we must be careful that the processes we put in place are going to actually enhance the outcome. Because I think that's really what we're looking at. How do we improve the outcomes? How do we eliminate that undue political interference in the appointment process? That's really what I think we're getting at, and where I would agree with you. I mean, on the role of the private sector, of course, I mean, I think it may have been unsaid by the panel, but I think we were focusing on institutions within the criminal justice sector rather than looking at fighting corruption in this broader context, which of course has to include a major focus on the private sector. But I think that's again where a specialized agency with the appropriate skills is required, because in order to break through those corporate barriers to identify the corruption, the hawks are not going to be capable of doing that. We're going to need real specialized skills in that, so we need to develop that.
Thank you. Any other additions?
Thanks. Yes, I think the issue with amending the Constitution, the challenge there is a political one, because political parties are all fighting to get that executive power that they can then use in their minds in an unrestrained way. And so in order to have the constitutional change, you have to have the political parties who operate in a particular way, who want to capture power for their own purposes, to agree to change something that means that when they capture power, they've got less power and more likely to be held accountable. So in many ways, we do need electoral reform. We need to think about, is the way that we run politics in South Africa and have elections and the way our democracy operates, is it actually serving the needs of the most vulnerable people in the country? And I think most of us here would agree it isn't. And what does civil society do about that? And one of the issues is to make that argument and to be a lot more willing to challenge all political parties. I mean, we're having elections next year. They're all going to say stuff where I doubt most of them have real much intention of implementing some of the things they're saying. They might be saying it just to get people to vote for them. And then hopefully we'll all go away for another 5 years and they'll just get on with doing what they do. Because, look at the political parties. How accountable are they themselves internally? When somebody who's a favored person in the party is implicated in wrongdoing, they're not in a rush to exactly hold them accountable. So there's a political culture in South Africa that is problematic, and it sort of replicates itself in the way the Constitution is ignored or implemented. But I think if we could get to a point where we could reform the Constitution, it would be interesting to start thinking about those issues. But I suppose our role in civil society is to keep highlighting that and to put the pressure on, and hopefully over time there'll be big shifts politically when the people of South Africa start thinking, well, we need to do something different, and wait for that and identify when that moment's there and facilitate that moment happening. And then on the private sector, completely agree with you. I think in many ways it's sort of, if you don't have a strong state that wants to hold everybody equal before the law, then the private sector just gets away with murder and become part of the problem. So it's not that I would say we ignore private sector, and I look forward to your research, and I think we should look at how we make sure that people in civil society, the media and others get to know about this, and that there's some kind of opprobrium internationally, not only locally. And we've seen some of that with companies that have been involved in state capture, and hopefully we see more of that with this kind of research coming out. But I suppose if you don't have a proper investigation capacity, a proper prosecuting capacity, then and a legislature that wants to make sure that the laws are clearly in favor of the most vulnerable and that they hold these massive companies accountable, you can't get anywhere. So in many ways, I think that's where there is a focus on, if you don't fix the state, then you're just going to have a rampant private sector. And maybe the first step is, well, it's not, they shouldn't be separate. You fix the state, at the same time expose the private sector and try and build momentum into shaming them or getting conversations going where if you're not misusing your wealth as a big auditing company or a big financial service company, that's a brand thing that you can then get more clients. People will trust you and invest in your products. But if it comes out that you're like a KPMG or others, or Bain or Gartner and these others, that could be the end of your business, where you would lose massive profits. That's something that civil society, I think, should also be playing more of a role in. So thanks for that.
Thank you. David?
Okay, well,
You have your one?
I've got my own. Okay, thanks. Well, I can't have two. Okay. So, well, I mean, I think those are kind of fair questions. I mean, the question would be, I mean, if one is going for a quite a deep level of reform, what would one target it at? Would one talk about amending the provisions of the Constitution relating to the power of the executive to make these types of appointments? Or should one be focusing on, for instance, the question of electoral reform? So one's trying to change the character of politics in South Africa. That would be the one question. But then also, I mean, just my understanding is that insofar as, you know, through the work that I've done, I've interacted with these the issues that you're raising. The inclination that, the orientation that people have taken is towards taking a position that we're working within the constitutional framework, but we're trying to create mechanisms to improve the way in which those kind of executive powers are exercised. So, for instance, the NDP proposal around creating a police board and so on would then, that you would have a mechanism for advising the president about the appointment of the National Commission. And so that's, so these are all, I don't know if they're tactical or strategic questions or what they are, but the one thing that also then just comes in is just this question about, the kind of culture of, and I think, when I was thinking about my presentation, I was thinking a bit about this, one can see a kind of continuity with the kind of apartheid system where members of kind of public servants are very much subordinate to political power. And so, so for instance, if we look around at the kind of the Vusi Pikoli suspension and dismissal, then essentially, his issue was that, he was, had been a loyal member of the ANC and all that, but he placed his loyalty to the Constitution over and above that. And so, you raising the issue about amending the Constitution, but in many ways what we're asking, what we need to also be prioritizing is that public servants should recognize that their first loyalty is to the Constitution. And so the problem with the political culture that we've inherited is that I think that it's that the ANC, it's like, loyalty to the ANC has been seen as taking higher priority than loyalty to the Constitution.
Thank you so much. More hands? We've got one. We've got 10 minutes. I'll just take two. Last two questions. Yep, I've got two hands. And the last one. Thank you. Three.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Belen, and I work for the European Union. A question to Lawson in regards to the role of Parliament, and indeed the main house for accountability within the premises of the Constitution. So how to engage the new legislator to make sure that the new legislature takes this role seriously, or in the way to deliver to the premises of the Constitution.
Thank you. What's the other hand? Yeah.
Thanks. Just two questions. The first one is on the aspect of accountability. Lawson mentioned the failure of Parliament to hold the executive to account. So what does it mean for us? Does that mean that we have to review or re-look at our electoral system? And so that's the first question. And the second one, Dale raised the point about where have we failed. If you look at what has been revealed in the last year with state capture and the immense role that civil society has played, yet civil society has been marginalized in the last couple of years with regard to funding and resources. Is it not something that we need to relook at as well in terms of increasing the role for civil society? Do you have the issue of political party funding being regulated? Should we not, in the same breath, also look at the expanding or improving the role of civil society? Thank you.
Thank you. Last one.
Just a simple question. There seems to be a concentration on legalities, changing the Constitution, challenging the Constitution, running to the courts and everything else. Has the notion of organizing people actually left the entire notion of how to change a society, how to hold people accountable within society? What has happened to organizing the masses? Because currently it seems as if people are saying that there is the notion of political will, but political will only comes if at all the masses can hold people accountable. And we're holding people accountable through the courts, and it does not relate necessarily to the masses that much. It's unless we organize the masses, where has that where's that gone to? Organizing the masses, being in communities, showing communities directly exactly as to how this affects you and why you need to hold an MP, your councillor, the corporation, everybody else accountable within that. Why is it that we're so legalistic in all of this? In as much as we're saying that there's no political will, I think that we've lost that will as people, just generally, in organizing the masses.
Thank you. I think also from my side, there's a whole loss of breakdown in trust between the public and the system itself, especially the criminal justice system. And we see it with the police. The communities in Westbury, the communities in the Cape Flats are hopeless, and many other communities in South Africa. And how do we trickle it down to communities, this conversation, to address the very same issue that the last gentleman is asking the question about? Because, I mean, in all of that, we had a huge outcry, people saying, oh, now the minister is addressing this issue, but we have a commissioner, which also comes to the issue of appointments. Are people actually able to address these issues? We've got the commissioner who's quiet. We've got a minister who goes out to communities and delegate and start telling communities things, but we've got a commissioner who's keeping quiet. Gareth, I think when you answer that, also take that into consideration. Amanda, do you have a question?
It was more of a comment. Lawson mentioned earlier the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. So I just wanted to give Corruption Watch's feedback on that, because we worked quite extensively on that earlier on this year. And it had initially started in 2016, and I don't know what the government had been doing, and it had been going back and forth. And it was only now in 2018 when they decided to do consultations in each of the 9 provinces in order to get feedback into the existing draft document. And so Corruption Watch had received funding, and what we decided to do was to almost be a watchdog and accompany them on these consultations in the different provinces, as well as to hold our own engagements with stakeholders. So what we found is that they actually, of all the 9 provinces, I think they only held 5 or 6 engagements. And what was supposed to happen in these engagements is they were meant to share the draft document and ask for input from the communities as well as from the sector, civil society, and as well as business. But we found that the engagements that they had, the majority of the room was government itself. And so the GCIS, the Government Communications Information System, or that department, they didn't send the right information to get people to even know about these engagements. So people didn't even know these engagements were happening. And so the interministerial task team is the one that has been tasked with putting these engagements together. And Corruption Watch held engagements because of funding restrictions. We couldn't go to all 9 provinces, but we held our own engagements in Alexandra, in Khayelitsha, as well as in the Northwest. And we got some really interesting feedback from communities and people on the ground that were telling us where they face issues of corruption. So for instance, we were told things how some people, we actually need corruption to be given, or information around corruption to be taught from early childhood development. It should be something that is entrenched in the culture of our children going upwards. Other feedback we got was with regards to police not wearing name badges, and how people can never really report which police are corrupt because it's not something that's legislated, or even if it is, the police are not doing it. A really big issue that came up was issues around whistleblower protection, and how people felt really afraid to blow the whistle on corruption because they don't feel protected, and there was nowhere that they felt that they had a haven to report corruption. So these were some of the things that came up from people on the ground, and we put this together into one final submission. And at the moment, also we've been told that they're currently incorporating this, and then they're then going to hold another engagement and present now the final draft, which is supposed to happen in November. And so once that does happen, we will then ensure that what Corruption Watch had, all that information that we had gathered, that it is indeed collated. And then following that, we don't know what is going to happen with the strategy, because one of the main issues and one of the recommendations that we made to the committee was that there needs to be ownership of this. I know Lawson mentioned that, you know, if there was that one agency, then they would be the ones who would be in charge of this. And it's one of the issues that we have as an organization, that there is actually if the president could actually have assumed ownership of the strategy, then perhaps people would take it more seriously. Because what we found is that almost very, very few people, even in our civil society engagement that we had, very few people were actually aware of that the strategy was actually in existence. So that's just the update on that.
Thank you. Lawson, do you want to go first? If there's any question you want to respond to, as you might have to leave early.
I think the two questions from Belen and Coogan were linked in terms of accountability, role of Parliament. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that, you know, we can't avoid tackling the issue of electoral reform, which I think David has already spoken about. You know, this is something that we need to address, and, you know, I'm certainly not suggesting that simply changing the electoral system is going to be the magic bullet that is going to solve problems of accountability, because there's no evidence to suggest that a constituency system or some hybrid model is magically going to enhance levels of accountability between elected representatives and people. But I think we need to have a debate about that. Does the existing electoral system suit our needs at this point in the development of South African society? Should we relook at it? Should we look at a hybrid system that kind of operates at local government level? Or should we, you know, for example, look at the nature of the closed party list system and introduce some sort of primaries where people have a say into who makes it onto parties' electoral lists? So I think there are discussions to be had around that in order to try and enhance the accountability of Parliament. But I think the elections next year provide an opportunity to really question the role of Parliament in our society and its failures over the last several years. Because politicians are coming to us to ask us to vote them into Parliament. Well, what is it that Parliament does? You know, it's supposed to hold the executive to account. It's supposed to ensure that public monies are appropriated and spent according to those budgets. And that gives us an opportunity to engage on the issue. Just very briefly on the issue, Coogan raised the issue of funding, and we should have a whole session on funding of civil society. But you know, I think that there are concerns that, you know, things seems to have changed since December last year with the election of Cyril as president of the ANC. The enthusiasm that business had for supporting civil society suddenly disappeared because they're all now Cyril's best buddies. So that money is gone. And you know, that links into the point that the speaker at the back raised about organizing people. So there were attempts. I mean, there was the Save South Africa campaign with all its flaws and problems, but it did mobilize people against state capture during 2016 and 2017. So I think there were attempts to do that where we brought together people, but I think, you know, so speaking for myself, I don't want to speak for the other organizations sitting at this table, but, you know, I think as professional elite NGOs, which is what we are, our role is to provide the information and to facilitate the distribution of that information at a grassroots level. And we need to develop partnerships with those grassroots organizations to ensure that that happens. And that's perhaps a failing that we have, is that we put the information out there, but we don't really follow through on how it's being used. We, you know, as again, from a CASAC perspective, we don't have the capacity, nor is it our role to do that, but we need to be able to facilitate that happening. So I think your point is a valid one, but we perhaps need to have other people in the room to discuss how we can do that more effectively.
Thank you. Gareth?
Thanks. Yes. I mean, on the issue, I'll just respond to, we do need to increase the role of civil society, and it is a bit worrying now that everybody thinks state capture is over, that we can just go back to being relaxed and there's nothing. But as I was saying earlier, there's this, you know, we've just taken the first small steps, and there's a lot that needs to happen. And it won't necessarily happen unless there's active pressure on the state to make things happen, on politicians to make things happen. And it just speaks to a bit about the role of different groups. So Lawson just mentioned this. We do need to see much closer relationships between those that mobilize communities and can translate information into ways that are better understood, so that there's better political pressure on politicians for the right things. Because I think what you see, and like you asked me to respond to this, so the police minister goes to a place with suffering from gangs and says, well, the solution is I'm going to bring in the tactical response teams. You know, highly militarized units that literally just walk in with automatic weapons and only know really how to shoot people. They don't actually get trained in very much else. And people seemingly, or certainly at those meetings, seemingly think that's a good idea. But once again, if you go into those communities, you realize that it's far more complex. And sometimes politicians try and present the issues as this is a simplistic response. We can fix this problem in the following way. And we'll see this coming up, I think in the next elections, everybody's going to be promising they'll be tackling corruption, when they're not able to do that in their own parties. But worryingly, they're going to you'll see a xenophobic line coming out. The DA's already come out with immigrants are the problem, that's why we have crime, that's why we have a problem with poverty, and I can imagine some other parties will start doing the same kind of thing. So it is important that civil society organizations that are keen to protect the most vulnerable, that understand the importance of people's rights and dignities and want to improve the lot of the most vulnerable, those that are interested in a social justice agenda, do work much more closely together so that those of us that spend a lot of time trying to do the research and understand how these things work can work in partnership to make sure that that gets to people in the communities, and the other way around, that we ourselves can hear what the communities say and understand what they need and what we can do for them as well when we do our research and work like that. We've started doing a lot of work amongst young South Africans and I'm trying to understand what are the factors that make them want to vote or not vote. And it's very clear that there's a huge amount of cynicism amongst young first-time voters. They really don't actually see political parties as the solution, which is why we're seeing communities are not just sitting back and saying, well, we don't trust political parties. They are active. I mean, if you just look at the year-on-year increase in the amount of what the police call unrest incidents, which means a variety of things, but it means that police have to go somewhere and shoot rubber bullets or tear gas or intervene because communities have lost faith in using the Regulation of Gathering Act because it doesn't work for them, it's not designed to, and are taking action, political action, to try and draw attention to their needs. It just shows that there is a mobilization. I think there's an opportunity now for us to work more closely across the different sectors. So it should not be an either or. It should be a collective action between all of us who believe in social justice, working across different organizations to bring our different strengths and capabilities towards very common objectives.
Thank you so much. David, anything to say?
Oh, I've got mine. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've got anything to add, but I just would welcome the question about organizing the masses, or just, to me, I would frame it as a kind of effective anti-corruption politics. You know, the point about the forthcoming election, and so, you know, one of the problems with anti-corruption politics is that everyone formally is anti-corruption. Jacob Zuma was, you know, anti-corruption. And so, I mean, it's also a kind of limitation or weakness of civil society about the business of developing a kind of strategic and cohesive program around something complicated like corruption. So, for instance, you know, we've already thrown around a few questions around priorities, but for instance, this issue of a single, you know, a key anti-corruption agency. Currently, the kind of orthodoxy is in favor of this multi-agency system. There isn't kind of agreement around that kind of issue. So in terms of kind of trying to move forward with a kind of anti-corruption program, there's a lot of things that can, you know, are potentially issues around which there wouldn't necessarily be agreement or clarity.
Thank you so much. Amanda, are you fine?
No, I'm good.
Thank you so much. Right on time. Thank you so much. Please look out for the report that David Bruce will be working on. We'll be hosting further events similar to this, where we'll be having discussions. Thank you so much.
Sorry, before we disperse, just one little announcement. After lunch at 2 o'clock, there's going to be a debate down in the auditorium downstairs, political parties, how they're going to take these issues forward into their election campaigns, and if they get elected, what are they going to do on these issues?
Yes, sir.
Hosted by Karima Brown, and be potentially carried on radio and television later on today and into the weekend. And then afterwards, after the debate, we're going to have drinks downstairs. Thank you.
Woo, woo. Drinks.